And now the last speaker, definitely not the least of this session, is going to be Isabelle from 42 Crunch. She's going to be joining us to talk about the API security from the design perspective. Hello, Isabelle.
Hello, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good, good.
Pardon my church bells in the background if somebody can hear them. Apologies. Great, so I'm going to let you kick off. So why don't you start with a brief introduction of yourself and then the outline of the talk, and then I'll meet you here back on the stage in about 20 minutes.
Wonderful.
Stage.
All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in this world, to everyone. So my name is Isabelle. I'm one of the co-founders here at 42 Crunch, and we're here to talk about API security. As you will have seen from the program, I guess, at API Days, it's becoming a very hot and common topic because it's a real complex problem. And we are going to take an approach today about, design time really, because there's a lot of problems that we see as we work with our customers that we know could have been avoided if we had thought about security way earlier than we're usually doing it. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. So problems are piling up really. Recent reports showing no way to really slowing down on the problems around APIs. It's only normal, I would think, considering how important they are or pervasive they are across every industry. And it's pretty much the way to integrate and to create new applications today. So it's not really a surprise that we have more and more problems. And if you want to see and learn and about the current issues going on in the market. I hope you've been hearing about API Security.io. It's something we've been curating for, well, just 3 years now. Time is flying. And really, go there to learn about the mistakes that others are making. And that's how you probably, can avoid some of those. And what are those mistakes? What do we see as problems? And what is triggering those API security problems? Well, really it's a combination of things, and it's a lot still of input validation. We've been saying this for about 20 years. You must not trust the data that comes your way. Well, we're still doing that, so you have to be careful about this. We'll talk about that in a minute. Rate limiting plays a huge role in API attacks, and we'll talk about that a bit as well. Of course, data. It's all about data. Which data do you send back to your consumers or to potential hackers, and controlling that data, and of course anything around authorization and authentication. So that's kind of the highlights. So which is why we have this OWASP top 10 for API security. What I've done here is a bit like grouping the typical problems around, I would say, three buckets, right? One bucket around data, so everything which is in blue in that list is about how do we manage the data that comes our way, how do we manage the data that goes out. The typical injections, we have much less of those in the API world than the traditional AppSec application world, but still this is still a problem. Of course, anything around authentication and authorization, and I call this governance and operation, which is really about how do we configure the systems, how do we configure our APIs, how do we do login, monitoring, etc. Right? So all those problems which are happening, why are they still happening? And this is really something that we see across every customer we may be talking to. The first thing is we may not have really realized that using APIs has changed completely, the attack surface, and has changed also how we expose again information, right? We used to have a way to control much more the information on the back end, on the server side. We will only just return UI stuff, JavaScript and HTML. But now what we're doing is just, point some framework to a database, create some CRUD interface on top of it, and exposing it as a REST API, as a GraphQL API. Doesn't really matter, but what we are exposing is really raw data, right? So that access to data is really what creates a lot of the problems that we have today, right? So that's the first really thing we have to realize. The second thing is, and we're seeing this everywhere, is really security is still really an afterthought. It's at the end of the API lifecycle. We've been writing a lot of code, and then suddenly we're being hit by the AppSec people telling us, hey, we have to review this, you have to go to this test, this is a report, go fix this. It comes so late in the life cycle. It's a problem for everyone, really. So that's really the core of the presentation today, is how we do address this typical problem. And again, API is all about data. And one of the other problem we see everywhere, and is that traditional security approaches, which have been to build walls around our data centers, is really not working anymore, because there are no more walls. When we create applications, we're going to create applications that just go and compose data from many different sources. Those sources can be ours, but it can be from outside system, SaaS applications that we're using, whatever it is, right? So we really need to understand that we need a different approach, because we are not protecting the same thing. We're protecting data and flows of data going across multiple systems, right? So the traditional ways of just building walls and looking at attacks is really not working anymore. And then finally, something which is really, frankly, a huge problem today is the scale at which we're creating applications. And frankly, we've equipped developers with very, very, productive ways of writing applications. They're creating more and more applications. So we're talking about 400, 500 APIs is really what we see everywhere we go, up to like thousands of APIs, right? But what we haven't really scaled is the tools that the AppSec guys are using, and also the AppSec guys themselves. Which we have tons of developers, and the ratio that pretty much everyone kind of agrees on right now is we have one AppSec person for like 100 developers. So as you can see, anything which is manual, anything, what happens whenever there is a new API popping up, or which happens very often, or new versions of APIs popping up, how do we scale and how do we make sure that those APIs are actually secure? Okay. So our call to action really here is, rather than being, which are a bit right now is what we see, reactive. So again, we're at the end of the life cycle, and we try to see whatever we can do to make sure and test that things are actually secure. We'll have to really become much more proactive about this, right? And I will illustrate this with this cartoon. So this is not something against Agile, not at all, but this is really about, the fact and realization that there's a lot of things that you will have to decide at design time that really are, in many cases, very hard to address and fix later in the life cycle. So that's kind of the extreme case with the cartoon here, where they just created the hole before building the castle. So it's going to be a problem now. But really, when we see this everywhere, right? So the design issues and the design decisions that you're making have a long-lasting impact on everything, right? And I'm seeing this every day with customers, with people telling me, well, yeah, we would love to fix this, Isabelle, but the thing is, we'll have to do a new version and fix that now. If only we had known about that problem earlier, right? But they didn't. So and the other thing is, none of those issues are going to automatically fix themselves. So you may be able to detect them, through different type of tooling and processes, but that doesn't fix them, right? And the other problem is you really need to put yourself in a process whereby you discover and address those issues early, so they don't make it all the way to production to start with. The end game, that's really what we're advocating at Crunch, is like the end game of creating security APIs it just cannot be. It will not work to just have everything working the way it works and leave it this way, and we just don't look at security anything, and we just wait very late to see if something magical is going to catch those problems, right? It will not work. It cannot work. We've known this for 30 years. We have to address those problems way earlier. Now, it's easy to say. Now, what does that mean? What do we do, right? Well, first of all, and everyone is going to tell you this, you cannot secure what you don't know. So you have to know your APIs, right? And what do I mean by that? Well, the first thing is security is not a one-size-fits-all. So not all your APIs are equal. You probably have some which are more sensitive than others. that are doing more sensitive operations, which are manipulating more sensitive data, whichever industry you're in, right? It doesn't really matter. But you have to know that. So before you start jumping and creating some code, right, you really need to understand, okay, we're creating this API. What is it all about? What will it do? What is the data that will be addressed by this API? What are we going to expose? To who? Is this an API we're going to expose it to the entire world? Is it only to ourselves? Is it only to specific partners? But you have to know that. And one thing also which is critical is if any of those parameters change, you have to reassess, the decisions you may have taken. So if an API that was originally designed to be consumed internally suddenly becomes used by whoever on the internet, right? The security challenges around that are very different, right? So you need to really address those, know about those, and work together, development, security, on how we're going to address this, right? So as in anything, probably you want to do some kind of threat model on top of your APIs. There's like the stride model you may have heard about from Microsoft. It's still relevant. There are other ways. This is kind of the standard way of doing things, but it gives you a framework for assessing what are the threats and how do you address them. So that's the first thing, like know your APIs. What do we have? What do they do? And who is going to use them? And the second thing, Frank was explaining this now on Smart Bear and the tools that they're working on contracts and definitions, right? So this is something we're seeing everywhere, is that we need something really that allows every single consistency, all the teams within the company, to understand what is this API, like build a shared understanding across the consumers, across the developers, and across cybersecurity on what is my API doing. And again, being able to express what we have designed in a standard way that will then give us a lot of things. It will allow us to validate that our API actually behaves the way it should be behaving. It will allow us to, create mockups, and will allow us to do automated testing. There's tons of tools that when you do the effort of creating a contract, really, you have huge number of benefits now. What used to be something that was barely, used by everyone for documentation only, right, is now something that has become the core and the center of like the development tool set for APIs. So you have tons of tools and tons of frameworks and tons of things you can take advantage of if you express this contract. And from a security standpoint, it's about knowing what it is that we are going to expose. So we all have a common understanding of that. So we can make sure that whatever was designed as part of that design phase is what we have implemented and is what we are actually delivering. So choose your, open API, async API, as Frank was saying, it really doesn't, but have a standard way of describing that. Now, what does this design imply? Well, first of all, data, right? So if we look at the OWASP top 10, we have a bunch of problems related to data. Normal, because that's what APIs are all about. They're all about exposing data. So we can formulate what is the data that we are going to allow inbound, what is the data we're going to allow outbound, define constraints like you see on the screen here. Is this a big string, a small string? What's the pattern? So we should know about those, right? And define also what are our PII. So this is really something you have to master as well, right? So of course we know about email and social security numbers across the world, etc. But you will have your own. The scope of PII has really grown, and depending on your industry, there are things that work for you and don't work for others. You also have to make sure you have them in different languages, maybe as you have here in Spanish and in French. So you have to know these. So when something is going through, is it PII or not? And if it is, what do we do? Do we block for that specific API? So you have to know that data in order to take any decisions. And now, it's kind of obvious to everyone that the body of something is the data, but you have plenty of other data flowing around, right? You have headers that contain data. You have JOTs. JSON Web Tokens are a huge, place where you're going to see data flowing in and out. So you also have to manage and describe and control that data. And of course, error responses. So this is also something you have to think about. what is it that I'm going to expose as errors to my consumers, right? So define that. Is it normal that I'm sending back whatever, some internal information? Probably not. But that needs to be designed again. And this is really hard again. This is the kind of things which are very, very hard to fix after the fact. You'll have to redesign this if you made a mistake there, right? Then access control. So this is all about, what are my operations? How do I expose them? Authorization policies, okay? So the top one problem right now in the API top 10 is an authorization problem, right? Which is this BOLA, you may have heard about IDOR, which basically is all about making sure that I, as Isabelle, can only access the data, the resource that I'm allowed to access to. So this is not about an operation like, API register, as you see on the screen here. I'm allowed to do API register. Okay, that's all cool. Or get user info. But if I do get user info, can I do get user info with only my data, or can I do it with the data and get the access to data of someone else? It is not a simple problem. It's really an authorization problem at the core. So that's again something you will have to design. Really from a high level design point of view, this is something that really shouldn't be in your code for many different reasons. It will be difficult to maintain if it's in your code. So you should really have some external authorization policies that you can use. But again, this is something you have to properly design, right? Design your IDs. What is the format of those? How are we going to expose them? Again, something very complicated to change after the fact. Who has access to what again? What are the operations? Do we have any admin operations? Who is going to have access to those, right? So this is, defining that contract with all the constraints around that contract is what you really need to do here, right? And once you have that contract, what this will allow you to do in many different places, this is true of our tools, but is to take a positive security approach, which basically means I know what my data should be inbound, outbound. I know what the operation should be. I know what the verbs are allowed. I know all of that because we have designed it. So now I can put something in place that will just look at the traffic and say, no, you're not, no, that's not valid against the contract. So we can block all that information inbound and outbound. So this is very important. APIs are all about exposing data. Validating responses is a critical aspect of it. Okay, so that gives me that positive security model approach. Okay, and finally, operating. So again, you'll have to deploy those APIs. There will have to be tracking them. You will have to be able to see logs to see why they're not working. So logging cannot be an afterthought. Adding logging and proper monitoring on a system after the fact is like mission impossible, right? So that is something you really need to design, create a framework. All developers we use, for example, you have to invest in this at the beginning of your, API project. Rate limiting is also something you have to design. So again, it's not about saying, all the APIs go 100 requests per second and that's it. No, especially you have some endpoints and then back to design again and knowing your APIs. So authentication authorization endpoints are very, very critical things that have to be proper design, rate limiting there. That doesn't work for other things. You may have other endpoints that are also very sensitive where rate limiting needs to be specific. So go and design that and make sure whichever tool you're going to choose that they can do rate limiting by operation, for example, by validation of a claim, JSON Web Token, whatever it is that you can use as something to uniquely identify a request. IPs are a bit complicated, so have a look at more deep and maybe fine-grained rate limiting operations there. And finally, the life cycle, right? So what do we have? Version 1, version 2, version 3. There are plenty of breaches that you will see on APIscene.io, which are related to things that have been opened once to make some testing, or because it was the first version and we just forgot there, but they still have access to production systems. So you really have to manage those. You have to know and manage and have the framework around your APIs to be able to know when to retire things. Okay. So what is my call to action? Really, we have the chance in the API world to have this API top 10 that we can really use as a framework for designing and testing our API. So use that as the framework of what are the top issues that you need to look in your threat model, right? And start looking at security at design time. So it comes from this design I was talking about. It comes to, what authentication are we going to use? How authorization is going to work? What is the data we're going to do, right? Because any problem you find way later, first of all, I see this every day with customers, right? First of all, it's going to cost you much more. And when I'm saying costing, it's money in the end, but it's really effort. Sometimes it's like rewriting part of the API when it was something that would have been super easy to do if we had discovered that problem way earlier through testing and other ways and reviews, etc. Right? And then you really need to think, how do I, make sure that my API is actually working the way they should? Is you really need to start thinking like hackers and hack yourselves, right? So leveraging those contracts, this definition we have built, we can create negative tests. For every, test that is, oh, this is working, you should have a test that's like, oh, what happens if? What happens if I'm not sending you a token? What happens if I'm sending you data which is not in the wrong, which is in the wrong format, in the wrong type even, users that don't exist, whatever, right? You have to think about all those. And finally, you will have to automate. So that's another key advantage of having all this design and those contracts, is now you can automate this testing, you can automate the deployment, you can automate. This is the only way you're going to scale to the hundreds of APIs. The minute you have more than 10, it becomes pretty much impossible to do things at scale, right? Whatever is manual in testing and anything you can do to, make sure you have the proper policies in place, make sure you have all the testing in place, anything you can automate, do that step by step. Okay. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. As encourage you to subscribe to APIsecurity.io. There's a lot of great information there about problems and tools and some of those best practices, which I hope will help you make your APIs more secure.
Great. Thank you very much, Isabelle. That was fascinating. I'm sure there's loads that we can apply across the API industry, really, from your learnings. I wanted to ask you one question from the CTO perspective. So you mentioned that, we still, after 20 years, often treat security as an afterthought, whereas actually we should be thinking about it as I think you used the term proactive security.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, from the CTO perspective, where do you see is the biggest, I guess, space for change? Is it a technological thing? Is it a planning issue? Is it a mindset change that we need to be thinking about?
That's a interesting question. Our CTO used to say that security is a journey and it's not a tool, or and this is really what this is. It's about first of all, is a mindset. I think is the first thing. There's still a lot of I would say silos today in the security world, where the security teams might not be so engaged with development. So I think the first thing is to realize that this is teamwork and we'll have to work together. That is the first mindset. Without that mindset, the whole I would say journey of starting from design all the way to production is going to be more complicated to do, right? And then the second thing I would really start worrying about is really this automation. Is like look at what is done today, what can be automated, how can I enhance the flow of information and across again the different steps of the development of my APIs, at a very high level.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you. It's definitely a journey, but
yeah.
Do you see that we're making progress? Are CTOs bringing security people more into the process from early on?
We do. So there's something really that has changed in the past, I would say year and a half, is this huge movement and across around API security, and people really understanding this is like the next big thing and it's really a problem, etc. What we have seen working really well at our customers is two things. The first thing is to really take a person from the AppSec teams and really kind of blend them into the development teams. So you really, and again, embed and encourage you the the security mindset within development, right?
Mm.
That's the first really approach. The second, so yes, we're progressing on that. The second thing is really, and that's where we are really focused at For Crunch, I would say, is to create tools and start onboarding tools which are really developer focused. So very up to very recently, we had the notion of doing DevSecOps was to take the security tools and just tell the developers to actually use them. And that really doesn't work because developers, those tools are not made for developers. So it's also coming to the realization that if you want your development community, and you have to really do that for many different reasons that I mentioned, if you want a development community to really be involved into security, you have to equip them with tools which are developer focused. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
So that is really critical. If you try to take the traditional security tools and tell the developers to use them, that is not going to work because that's not integrated in their flows. It makes them unproductive. It's going to just give you a lot of pushback.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
just go and find tools which are really made for developers, which are making them, security savvy and
Yeah.
helping in the security journey.
Yeah. Yes. I think that's a great place to start, and definitely a good reminder for everybody again. Thank you very much for the fascinating talk.
My pleasure. You have a great rest of the day, everyone.
You too.
Thank you very much for attending. Thank you.